Okay, welcome everybody to our new seminar. It's been a while since we've recorded a seminar on our network, and this is the first time recording under the name EliPro. So thank you everybody for joining us. Today we have the pleasure of having Professor Yuko Goto Butler here to tell us something about her research, which we have framed under the umbrella term of global Englishes, but she will give us more precise details during this presentation. I just want to remind our viewers that we are currently recording the sessions. So if you would not like to have your cameras, your face turned on, that's absolutely all right. You can just type your questions in the chat for Professor Butler, and she will address it towards the end of the presentation. But yeah, I would say that the floor is yours, and whenever you're ready to share your slides and begin the presentation, just go ahead, Professor Butler. Thank you again.
Well, thank you so much, Paolo, for your introduction, and thank you everybody for coming to my talk. And I'm very, very excited to have this opportunity. Thank you so much. So let me share my screen first. Again, my name is Yuko Butler from University of Pennsylvania. So I will take a macro view today and then discuss the assumptions and complexities and associated with the early English education, focusing on societal and global impacts. So I'm going to draw some previous studies, including my own work. So in this presentation, I include several photos, and most of them came from my own study sites. And here is one of the examples from a Japanese classroom. In Japanese classrooms, students do not always sit on the floor. Sometimes they do, but I hope that you can get some feel from the Japanese classrooms. Anyway, so here is the outline of my talk. After a brief background, I'm going to discuss the assumptions and complexities in early English education. And I'm going to address four agendas. First, a neoliberal ideology. Second, divided by socioeconomic status, SES, or social class. Third, parental influence. And finally, the earlier the better belief and native speakerism. I'm going to conclude my talk by mentioning future directions, which is composed of intercultural understanding and considerations for AI. So, as a brief background, I'd like to define what we mean by young language learners in my talk today. And I'd like to define them as children learning additional language or languages in an instructional setting. And age range is somewhere around 5 to 15. So it covers preschool and pre-primary school, and then primary school and middle schools. And this group of students are quite heterogeneous. So some of them in an English as a foreign language program, some of them are in content and language integrated learning Creole programs, some of them might be in bilingual immersion programs, and then some others are in English medium instruction programs. So they came from various types of programs. So we're talking about quite a heterogeneous group of children in this talk. So, assumptions and complexities in early English education. I'm going to talk about four agendas one by one. Start with neoliberal ideology. So, neoliberal ideology behind early English education can be referred to something like obtaining proficiency in English is a valuable commodity that brings political, economic, and social success to individuals and nation states. This is a very prevailing belief. But if you look at the empirical research, this is not necessarily supported by research. So this is a photo that I took in a primary school in China. And as you can see, it says English class brings happiness, love, and respect to all. So the question is it really true? Is it really true for everybody? The neoliberal ideology often leads to the hegemony of English, This graph shows the case in Europe. So you're familiar with this context more than I am. But as you can see that, of course, and there are some variability across different countries, English is by far more popular, compared with other languages, in this case, French and German. On average, 83% of primary school students in the EU were learning English as a foreign language. Um, so this is the reality at this point. And such statistics is also supported by empirical studies. So for example, Nikolov in 2009, in Hungary, students with higher SES choose to study English over German, and the outcomes of English learners were higher compared with German learners. In Asian context, myself talk about in many regions in Asia, English is offered as either the first foreign language or the sole language. So people do not have any choice to learn another language. Or English medium instruction, while this is rapidly spreading, some evidence shows that EMI, without support for the development of L1 literacy, negatively influences children's learning of subject matters. And Kucha talks about African context, but I'm pretty sure it can apply to many other contexts. Now, in this photo that I took in Hungary, you see a Union Jack in front of the class. And then, you can argue that this may influence a children's mind and attitudes towards English, which is indeed the case. So, emphasis on English learning in the curriculum, directly or indirectly, really influences children's attitude towards English and other languages. So Heinzmann, for example, she looked at grade 5 primary school students in Switzerland, already had much stronger motivation to learn English than French. So she says, children find it considerably more worthwhile to learn English for intrinsic, instrumental, and lingua franca related reasons, that they find English considerably more important than French, and that they're willing to invest somewhat more time and energy into learning English than into learning French, unquote. Now, in contrast, such strong presence of English in international communication discourages students from learning other languages in the context of UK or US. Now, here is one of my studies conducted among parents with primary school students in Jiangsu province in China. So this is the response among parents to the response to the statement. I think I have no problem if my child will be able to speak English better than our home language or languages. And as you can see, regardless of their socioeconomic backgrounds, parents tend to agree with this statement. Such parental influence can be really substantial in early English education. So there is a concept called parentocracy proposed by Brown. Brown described the socio-historical developments of British education in 3 waves. The first wave is a rise of mass schooling for the working class that happened in the 19th century. And in the second wave, there's a shift from social predestination, basically why you're born, to meritocracy, based on your achievement or talents. In the third wave, from meritocracy to a quote, a system whereby the education a child receives must conform to the wealth and wishes of parents, unquote. So, borrowing this concept, Enova says English has been positioned as a high status subject likely to attract consumers, parents acting on behalf of their children, in the purchase of access to schools offering an early start to learning English. Now, providing English education to young children is considered part of good parenting. That gives parents a lot of pressure, at least in some context. So here's the case in South Korea. In South Korea, early study abroad programs are very popular. Here, I don't mean to refer to some sort of short summer camp abroad or anything like that. Children really spend more than a year or even few years, often accompanied by their mothers. So these photos are guidebooks for such mothers. I found them in the bookstores in Korea, and then you can see some words in the photos, such as mom's English or Mongolish. So mothers need to brush up their English to go to an English-speaking country with their children. And then usually the fathers are left behind in South Korea. So early study abroad is popular, really popular, not only among affluent families, but also middle class families. Importantly, there's a number of ethnographic studies and early study abroad programs. The kinds of experiences that the children and their mothers have tend to be different by socioeconomic status. And some of the empirical studies, and most of them are ethnographic studies, these beautifully illustrate their experiences, not only when they're abroad, but also after, going back to Korea. So as you can imagine, they're not really happy stories only, and their experiences often differ by SES, as I mentioned. So, for example, this is one of the studies done by Park and then Abelman. English is not simply cosmopolitan strivings, but instead an intergenerational cubicle in South Korean society. This means that basically children's high proficiency in English is not only represents the mother's desire to have their children become members of the global society, but also reflects the mother's own educational history and social class. So, children's success in early English learning also reflects mother's identity and social positioning. I'd like to mention that early study abroad is found not only in South Korea, but also other neighboring places like China as well. Now, early English education, particularly bilingual immersion programs and EMI, is spreading, and it's also considered as a means to be bilingual, which is very much valued in society, as long as they're English speaking bilinguals and good English speaking bilinguals. So early EMI is equated in parents' mind with good education and learning outcomes. Emergent programs and EMI programs are often welcomed by parents in that they foster English speaking bilinguals. So one of the languages has to be English, but other local languages and or multilingual competencies among language minority students are often devalued in those programs. So people address concerns for a negative impact on linguistic and cultural diversities of local communities. So, for example, Kirkpatrick and Boy, and for example, addressed the concern in the case of ASEAN. ASEAN is Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Um, the, I mentioned about early English programs going abroad, early study abroad programs. That destinations of such, study abroad programs are actually not limited to so-called English-speaking countries such as UK or United States, Australia, but also other places such as Singapore and Hong Kong, at least in Asian context. So that those who decided to go to Singapore and then Hong Kong, they tend to hope to acquire both English and Chinese. So Chinese is considered another powerful lingua franca in Asian context. But parents really concerned about Singlish, the local variety of English. But interestingly, children themselves seems to have much more kind of flexible mind. So Kang says early study abroad children could effectively position themselves as a new type of desirable transnational subject who has much awareness and willingness and flexibility to adapt to local culture norms while still distancing themselves from the local identities those norms index. So they flexibly kind of switch over, when they talk to their friends, they might use as English, but in academic context in the classroom, they try to follow quote unquote a standard English. Now, zeal to acquire bilingual competency really promoted the private sector, at least in some regions. Of course, and there are variations across nations, but in some countries, private education is just huge, gigantic. So here's the news headline from South Korea. English language kindergarten in Seoul cost 1.36 million won, which is almost equivalent to 1,000 US dollars a month. Classes last over 5 hours. Now, commodification of children's English learning is also really abundant, and it is often sold with images of native speakers. So the picture on your right-hand side came from an advertisement for an English language school for Japanese children. As you can see that the teacher and the child illustrated with a native speaker image, even though this is programmed for Japanese children. So you don't see Japanese children in the advertisement. So the native speakerism suggests basically a belief that native speakers are the best language teachers. It's still really strongly supported by parents and general public, especially when it comes to pronunciation. So parents believe that native-like pronunciation is the most important qualification for teachers of early English education. I also have to add that if I really closely examine business models of such private early English programs, they often offer transportation services, like, from schools to home, and then after hours service with extra cost, of course. Um, so it also functions as a babysitter for working parents with money. So English as a babysitter in this context. Now, as you can easily imagine, you can find many, many apps for English learning for children. I ask my students in my child SLA class to correct some apps, and then there are just these are just some of them. Um, it is really hard for parents to choose because there are way too many. On top of that, for most apps, their effectiveness is largely unknown. So we don't know exactly how useful or effective they are. Now, we have seen that early English education is very expensive or costly for parents and schools. One of the significant issue is disparities by socioeconomic status or social class in terms of the quality of English education that children receive. So, as mentioned earlier, early English education is introduced with the premise that it will bring children opportunities for the future or in global world. So Peter Sayer discussed, he questioned, is English opens many doors for you? That is the premise that Mexican government had. Is it really true for everybody? So he found that basically English lessons most likely reproduce social class differences. And he went on to say, under the existing structural identity in Mexico, early English education that is constrained by class based pedagogies and a hidden curricula does not open doors for working class children, as the policy proclaims. So, what he found was, in a school in affluent urban area introduce English with newer pedagogies and with qualified teachers. And however, in socioeconomically lower urban schools, teachers offered a very traditional instruction. And for example, children are simply is instructed to copy what the teacher wrote on the blackboard and then did series of mechanical spelling exercises and so forth. So that Sayer really emphasized the class-based pedagogies and hidden curriculum that really that do not bring opportunities for working class children. Similar situations have also been found in other areas. I myself also conducted studies in China and found very similar challenges. So the same premise but different outcomes. So-called prestigious primary school could attract children from high SES backgrounds and better qualified English teachers. And then schools were increasingly becoming a means to perpetuate socioeconomic class conditions. So I took this photo in a school located in a lower SES school. As you can see, the slogan goes, enjoy English, enjoy life. So in this particular province that I conducted studies, that a government introduced a curriculum content and lower that the government reduced that a curriculum content and lower the standards because the government concerned that increasingly heavy burden of English learning among children. But at the same time, the policy was designed to grant schools and individual students more flexibility to adopt English education to their own needs and purposes by reducing the minimum English requirement. So, if we accept that intention behind this new English education policy, excuse me, that slogan, enjoy English and enjoy life, may allow for multiple interpretations. It could mean that if you enjoy being good at English, you will have a happy life. That is the literal translation or interpretation. But it could also mean don't let English interfere with your life too much. Just enjoy it. And then you will have a happy life. Excuse me. So disparities by SNS, SES can be found in many aspects. We have already talked about early study programs, but others include parental support. There are differences by SES, or parental expectations and student expectations. Or, of course, in English learning outcomes and learning networks and digital and AI literacies. So I'm going to share with you some of my own studies conducted in China to address some of these points as an example. So one of the projects that I was involved was conducted in Jiangsu province in China, and then producing both a cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. So here's the design of the study. It has two cohorts, primary school cohort and then middle school cohort. And each cohort was composed of two schools. One was located in a lower SES, and the other was located in a high SES area. And for the sake of convenience, I called an L school and high H school. And then for each school, we follow the students for 3 years. So when it comes to primary school, we follow the students from fourth grade to sixth grade. When it comes to middle school, seventh to ninth grade. And in addition to that, we had focus students and 8 students from each class. And in total, there are 64 students. We chose these focus students based on a stratified and random sampling while controlling the gender, SCS, and general English language proficiency. So the number is relatively small, but we can argue that there are very good representation of the original cohorts. Now, these students have been learning English from grade 3, at least in a school, formal English school context. Now, first of all, parents' influence. So, one of the studies examined parents' involvement in children's English learning through interviews with select students. And what we found was at the fourth grade level, regardless of SES, parents encourage children to study English. So there's no SES effect. The children clearly articulated the utilitarian importance regardless of SES. Parents, regardless of SES, really encourage their children. So one child from lower SES, a school says, anyway, my mom tells me that I must learn English well, otherwise I'll be like her, who knows only a few very simple English words. Another child from lower SAS, a school, says, sometimes my mom tells me 5 to 6 times a day that it is important to learn English, even in the morning when she worked overtime the day before. When you get to sixth grade, high SES parents began to have less direct involvement in assisting their children's English learning, like, doing homework together. But they do provide their children with more opportunities to use English outside of school. So, such as, traveling abroad, watching English movies together, and then hiring English native speakers as tutors. Now, when you get to the eighth grade, lower SES parents continue to attempt to assist their children, but often fail to meet the children's needs. And lower SES parents lower their beliefs about the children's competencies, so they started lowering their expectations. In contrast, high SES parents' ability to provide their children with more opportunities to use English was increasingly advantageous. So at the eighth grade level, some lower SES students began to feel that English is not really directly relevant to their lives. So one of them says, because I do not plan to go abroad, there is no need to learn advanced English. Understanding few sentences is enough. But some students were frustrated, but they may still understand why their parents keep doing it, try to assist their English studies. My parents didn't go far in their education, so they have a strong concern for my performance at school. So there is a really gap what the parents try to do and then really students want. Now, SES influences on children's and parents' perceived competence. So SES influence the changes in parents' expectation as well as those of the children's own expectation. So this graph shows basically the x-axis shows the parental beliefs about their children's competence in English learning, learning English successfully, and then y-axis indicates the children's own expectation of their own English competence, learning competence. The white dots indicate the folks at the lower SES, and green dots indicate higher SES folks. So as you can see that the fourth grade level, um, you don't see the differences between that white and then green dots. You don't see any particular patterns. But when you get to eighth grade, and you can see a clear division between the two groups. So, regardless of SES, parents' strong beliefs about their children's ability to succeed in English learning at the primary school level. But you can see, the parents started lowering at the grade eight among as lower SES parents, and then so as the students themselves. I'm not talking about cause and effect relationship here. It's correlated at least, so you can see the relationship between them. So this is their perceived competence. Then what about the actual English learning outcomes? So here's the case of English listening and reading performance measured by a standardized test. This study was done, by looking at parental SES by focusing on income level. So the parental income level was divided by 4, and then first two are considered as lower income, and then the second two considered as higher income level. And at the fourth grade level, there's no difference between these two groups, and as far as the average score goes. And at the sixth grade, again, there's no differences in terms of their average scores, but you can see, the larger variance. That means that you can see more variability within each group. But when you get to the eighth grade level, you can see a clear SCS effect in listening and reading performance. Now, when it comes to speaking, I'm sorry you can't see the graph very well, but the SCS effect appeared earlier. Already at the fourth grade level, you can see the difference between the high and low SCS groups, especially this one. The pronunciation sticks out. So higher SCS folks develop a pronunciation. So what's the lower folks as well, but you already see the difference between these two groups. And the difference is are observed in other domains at the sixth grade level, not just the pronunciation, but other domains. And then when you get to the eighth grade, the gaps by SCS became even larger. So this is the speaking ability. We also examine students' networks of English studies using social network analysis. So we ask students with, who do you study English with? Such as, doing homework together, or, watching English movies or TVs or videos together, or listening to English music together, receiving extra, English lessons outside of the class, going to cram schools together, and so forth. So what I'm showing now is, just a part of the analysis results, and shows that a graphic representation of one class from the high SCS school. So each knot represent students in a given class. It's just one class. Numbers indicate their ID numbers, and then M and F refer to gender. The sides of the knots show English proficiency level, again measured by a standardized general proficiency test. So what you can see here is at the fourth grade level, networks are loosely connected, even though computer, describe groups using different colors, but the boundaries are very loose. In fact, we also have interview data to help us interpret this quantitative analysis. So again, networks at the primary school time, that boundaries are loose, and people often share, resources across boundaries. So if you finish your homework, you can share the homework result to somebody who do not belong to the same study group. And then also, networks at the primary school time are pretty much based on physical complexity, physical proximity. So, for example, I work with this, boy because he's sitting next to me in the classroom, or I work with so and so because we're living in the same neighborhood. So the groups are pretty much based on the physical proximity. And but when you get to the sixth grade, and then you can see a little division in the middle. This division is basically division by gender. So girls tend to work with other girls, and boys tend to work with other boys. But in general, you don't see that very, very strong boundary across different groups. But when you get to middle school, the pictures look very different. Now, these two pictures, the two graphs are, showing cases at high SES middle school and low SES middle school. You can see a quite difference here. That small dots without having any numbers, and these are the folks who are not in the same classroom. Now, you can see that students in high SES middle school, they expanded their network greatly. And the interview data also shows that some of the students even have, foreign friends as in their networks. And also, you can see that the networks are clustered around their proficiency level. So you can see one group at the bottom, and then there's a one in the middle, and then there are some independent players here. But anyway, there are two, very distinct characteristics. One is, they expanded their networks in great extent, and then also they tend to flock together around their proficiency level. Now, if you look at the lower middle school students, and their networks are not really clear, and then their networks is not as extensive as you can see in the high middle school students. Last gender is earlier the better beliefs and native speakerism. So the earlier the better belief, this is really prevailing, but we know that earlier does not really necessarily lead to better outcomes in foreign language learning context. And younger children are relatively slower in foreign language development, and the amount and then also the quality of instruction matter more than the onset of learning in general. But there is still a prevailing belief that the younger, the better, even among teachers of early English education in certain regions. So, Wellington, for example, pre-service teachers in an early childhood education program in Catalonia believe that the native speakers, because of their pronunciation skills, can help children acquire native-like pronunciation, and that native speakers are more authentic or real, more real. So I'm just wondering about really native speakers' pronunciation or local teachers' local accented English really do influence the students' English learning. So I conducted a study in Korea using a matched guise technique. I use a matched guise technique for this study because I thought it is difficult. It must be difficult to ask students directly using the terms such as, native speakers and nativeness. It could be a little bit too abstract. So that was the reason why I decided to use matched guise technique. I'm not quite sure how many of you are familiar with this technique, but basically, in my study, I found English Korean bilingual speaker. This bilingual speaker is balanced bilingual speaker, so extremely fluent in both American accented English, and then growing up in Korean immigrant families, and then she could mimic her parents' accented English. So she recorded the listening material, one in American accented English and then one in Korean accented English. and let the children listen. So grade 6 students from 2 different regions in South Korea listened to these 2 accented English. It turns out there was no difference in listening performance. However, children thought that the American accented guys had better pronunciation, was more confident, and would focus more on fluency than on accuracy, and would use less Korean in class. So basically, even though the teacher's accented English did not really influence children's listening comprehension, their perception was influenced by native speakerism already at the primary school level, if not earlier. And unfortunately, I did not have a speaking data, but assuming that the use of digital technology is much more common now. The students are exposed to not only teachers' English, but also other speakers' English. So the direct influence of teachers' accent probably, would be smaller now. Now, topics for the future. There are 2 items, intercultural understanding and AI technologies. So first, intercultural understanding. Now, unfortunately, there are many conflicts and wars in the world now, and I personally cannot help but wonder if we lack the understanding and sympathy as the same human being. Do we emphasize differences too much before understanding the commonalities? So, fostering intercultural competencies through English for young learners, in my view, is more important than ever now. But we tend to focus on, teaching food, different kinds of food in different countries or regions, festivals, famous places, and then people and so forth. But maybe we need to go beyond that. The Brian's model of intercultural communicative competence, this is very, very popular one, and then subscribed widely. But we need to understand that this was not designed for children. And so, in that respect, I want to draw your attention to Lee's model um, because this was focused on young children, the children in general. And then it has 3 phases. At the very first phase, authentic children culture should be the focus, by introducing rhymes, songs, and stories and games. So it really emphasized the understanding that children from diverse cultures enjoy similar activities to themselves. So pay attention to the commonalities. And then move on to the phase 2 and then phase 3, which are comparing and contrasting cultures, and then cultures in the wider world. So, for example, if you say English and then shower, in Japanese, we call them fox wedding. And I was talking to this to one of my colleagues, and he's from South America. And he says, oh my God, in South American Spanish, we sometimes call it witch's wedding. We're so very excited about the commonality here. It's a, way of thinking, thought structure where, we're deceived by some kind of superhuman power, right? And after understanding this commonality, we can enjoy the differences between the fox and witches. Why in Japan people use fox and why in South America people use, witches. The stories is also another effective way to understand commonalities across cultures. Um, Prototypes of stories, a lot of commonalities. We can find a lot of commonalities across the world. They may, even though they may use different characters and animals. Stories exist in every culture and, everywhere. And then children in particular really fond of stories. Now, as you know, that Cinderella stories can be found across the world. And we're not quite sure the origin of Cinderella stories, but I heard that the one in China, the shoe in the prince used to find his future princess was extremely small. So, in other words, women with small feet were considered valuable in old China. And so, at that time, and there was the practice of foot binding. So, girls' feet were tightly bound to make them small so that they cannot walk. So, they have to be dependent, right? And then that is considered valuable. And then from this kind of a story, we can connect to this issue of how women were treated at that time or to gender related discrimination and prejudice, not only in this particular place, but also wider context, wider places, especially for upper primary school students or middle school students. So, in any case, discovering common points in the first step towards the understanding of real culture. Now, lastly, issues with AI technologies. Now, social robots and other AI technologies, are they really effective in language learning? Um, we still have very limited empirical research to say anything definitive at this point, but limited evidence shows that there are some evidence showing that improve a children's motivation and engagement. There are some positive effects on vocabulary learning, but may not be a large gain, at least among preschoolers, and mixed results in reading and grammar. And we just don't know much about them. And children's perception of social robots are different by age and in experiences. So younger children tend to perceive social robots as their friends. But we have more questions than answers. Designing of AI technologies for children's learning, we don't know much about it. It has to be different from designing of AI for adult learners. Children's interaction with AI and its effect, long-term effect in particular, it's open question. Not only English learning, but also language strategies and habits, interactional styles, well-being. We don't know much about it. Implementation of AI, both in outside of the class and teachers' role in that process. How do teachers assist children's use of AI in an effective and ethically appropriate way? And many other ethical considerations in front of us, such as AI divide. So in this talk, I talk about this, background and assumptions and complexities in early English education and future directions. In conclusion, early English language education does not simply mean starting to teach English earlier than before. Age and context sensitive perspectives and indispensable to better understanding the complexities of early English education. So I'm going to stop here and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Butler. Absolutely fantastic. There are so many things I want to talk about because you cover so much ground, but I I just don't know where to start. I really liked all the points you covered. So, in the meantime, perhaps some of our attendees want to either raise your hands and ask a question in person, or you can just type in the chat and I can read it to Professor Butler for you. Um, but I really wanted to comment on, like, I really enjoyed the first part. I think I learned quite a few things from the first one, but the second part was really the one that I felt more relevant to what I'm working on right now because it focused on intercultural. Pedagogies and also on the impact of AI, which is actually something I'm researching, but not from a young learner's perspective. And I was unfamiliar with Reed's model, the one that you showcased, but I was familiar with Byram, and actually I'm working with another model which is even more complex than Byram's. And the advantage is that it addresses that point that you made at the beginning. Why do we even talk about this? Is, to go beyond that product-based teaching of culture. But the byproduct of that, the problem of that, is that it becomes extremely complex. And although I would really love to conduct this kind of research with children, I was like, how do we convey the complexity to children? So thank you for showing these sources, and I will definitely look them up because I might learn something new from it.
Yeah, this model is simple enough so that it's easier for teachers to understand and then also implement in their own classrooms. Yeah, so yes, I love the model.
Thank you so much for presenting this. Mona, you have raised your hand.
Like a good German, yes. If it's okay, I was just wondering, in your experience, how teachers react to these kinds of situations where we try to kind of bring in ideas that seem a bit different than what what their teacher education told them, and what your experiences in general or your advice on how to navigate this with teachers, not just because of their skepticism but also because of the 100,000 other things that they are told to do and to look at, and especially if we look at curricula or teaching contexts where culture still is very much approached as an essentialist national cultural element.
Mhm. So you were talking about disparities by socioeconomic status in particular, or um, in general?
Well, for example, the idea of bringing stories, right,
Oh,
to
oh,
to
okay.
look at commonalities in culture, and just this, it's a very, at least in my experience of education or school education,
Mm,
we tend to teach culture in terms of visible, tangible products, right?
yes. Uh-huh.
Rather than, I guess, values and concepts that are inherent in cultures. So I was just
Mhm.
wondering if you have any experience, advice, thoughts, comments on that aspect.
Yeah. So as I mentioned briefly, stories can be a very powerful one because we can often find stories, the basic plots are very similar, and but they have different characters and may have a slightly different endings and so forth, but the general storyline is very similar, like Cinderella stories. You can find Cinderella stories everywhere in the world, right? And then so you can introduce this kind of stories in your classroom, and then children know the stories, right? And then so excited about similar stories can be found in different parts of the world. So that is the beginning. And then, people started paying attention to different aspects of the stories. So then you can expand it to different, differences. But I don't think it's that difficult
Hmm.
if the teachers can start sharing a material among themselves. I found this, beautiful story, and then implement it in my class, and then share it with other teachers. So I think that professional development programs, we can emphasize on this type of activities. And because at least in the Asian context, we tend to focus on differences.
Hmm.
Culture A is different from culture B,
N-
and
Not
culture
only
B
not
is
only
different
Asian
from culture
context, if I
C.
can intervene, yeah, not
Yeah,
only.
yeah. So, but before doing that, we want to understand that we are the human being. We're the same human being, and
Mhm.
emphasize the similarities first, and then started paying attention to differences. And I think it's very important at the very, the earlier
Hmm.
level, to understand that making a bond among people, regardless of the contents, right? Or countries.
Yeah. So my expertise is more so with older learners, but last year I did a study together with a colleague in Germany, and we looked at the German curriculum for primary education, specifically
Mm-hmm.
did a GELT-oriented analysis of that,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of confirmed her hypothesis that she had, that she thinks, or she felt that actually primary education is much more suitable or more open for GELT-oriented teaching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe that also relates to culture. And maybe I was just thinking of that when you said, you can pass on a story that you found and that you found helpful, and maybe primary education should get some more attention in this field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment.
Perhaps if I can expand on what Mona was asking, yeah, definitely I can agree with the idea that we can promote this in professional development programs and things like that, and it can be uh, appreciated by students. But exactly because at the beginning you mentioned this idea of parentocracy, and perhaps teachers might be worried that like this kind of approach, it's just not what parents expect, and they are worried about the pushback that we might experience in that regard. And is there anything that can be done about it? Either the teachers themselves or researchers can do to support them. Sorry for the complicated question.
Yeah, this is a complicated story, and the parents, parental influence is so substantial. But at least one of the findings in my study in China was that, regardless of the socioeconomic status, parents are really wanted to help their children, right?
Mm,
But the way they help the children um, is it's kind of divergent, So as
right.
the children become older, that lower SES parents, they actually did not know how to help their children. So they tried to help them, like, telling them, hey, you need to do homework, right? And you have to sit in this room, and then I'm going to watch you doing the homework and things like that. That's their perception of helping the children study, but that's not exactly what the children want, right? So there are some mismatch between what
Yeah.
parents are doing, and then what the children want them to do. So I think the teachers can be a bridge between them, right? So teachers can have, a better understanding about what kinds of assistance that are necessary for their students, right? And try to communicate with the parents at a reasonable level, something that they can handle by themselves. I think that is going to be a first step. I think that parents tend to have unrealistic expectations a lot of times, really, really over the top, unrealistic. And then, as one of my graphs shows, that it doesn't matter if they lose our home language or languages, as long as they can be a fluent speaker of English and things like that. That's very extreme way of thinking, but it has strong presence there. So I think that teachers, role is to have a communication with parents, and then have more kind of lower narrow the gap between the students needs and then what parents do, and then also have more realistic or more appropriate expectation towards their children. Think I know
Right.
this is easy to say than do. um, yes, I perfectly acknowledge that, but I think as a first step, and then that's what we need to do.
Right. It's actually giving me some ideas. Maybe in the future, I, I I could I could think about doing
Yeah.
something about that. Um, there
Uh-huh.
is one last question that I wanted to ask, and then I will leave the floor to somebody else if you want to. But uh, again, going back to, all the research pointing, criticizing certain general assumptions, which, they are held by parents, but, it's not just the parents absorb them from the environment, from the media, and from the way education is built around these ideas, like this criticism. We know that this early start in English education is not necessarily beneficial. We know that this preference for native only education, native orientation is not necessarily beneficial. We've been knowing this for a while, but we can't seem to
Much
let it.
improvement, right?
Yeah, but but even not, I'm not necessarily talking about, okay, achieve immediate change, but just raise awareness outside of academia. We don't seem able to do that. Is there anything that we can do in that regard? I know it's,
Oh
I'm
my
asking,
God.
I'm asking
Yeah,
a
I
terrible
know,
question,
I
but
know. Sometimes I feel like I'm a little bit helpless, right? Every time when I see all this advertisement, yes, you're right. It hasn't changed that much. I think probably it takes for a long time. It takes for a long time. But I think we try to introduce the variety of Englishes in our classrooms as much as possible. That is the first step. So, for example, one project that I'm involved in, we started using AI chatbots as a supplement. So, we don't depend on it in the classroom, but outside of the classroom, and students can have a chat with the AI. And then we purposely introduced a variety of Englishes. So different agents speak English with different accents. And then so one with a New York accent, and then one is from India, and then so he speaks, English with Indian accent and stuff like that. And then when you started doing that from the earlier age, and children do not really care about the variety of Englishes that much. For them, it's just another varieties, and really enjoy. I like agent so and so because he's kind of cool and things like that, not because of his accent, right? So I actually began to think that maybe we can work with children first,
yeah,
and
I
then
agree.
I gradually change the entire system. I know it takes time, but I found that the children are very flexible and really enjoyed the variety of Englishes. And then one of the studies that I mentioned in today's talk is also that children who actually studied abroad in Singapore, and then in Singapore they have Singlish, that's the local variety. And then children seems to be very flexible. So depending on the context, and then they use Singlish, and then in other contexts, and then they use quote unquote standard, classroom English and things like that. So I think maybe it takes a generation to change it.
Right. Yeah,
But
yeah.
working with children, I see some, optimistic, development here.
Right. You raise a good point that I mean, I've thought about it before, but maybe I should consider it more, like about the importance of addressing this early. But yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there is much research focusing specifically on this in with
Mhm,
primary school learners, and there should be more, I guess. Yeah.
mhm, mhm. Yes, I agree with you. Mhm.
Thank you so much. Is there anybody, we still have time for a couple of questions. Does anybody have anything to ask to our oh, we have a question in the chat, if I can manage to look at it. Um Thank you for your very informative talk. What I understood from today's talk was that, based on your research, the most common misconception that teachers' parents have about children's English learning is that earlier is better. But what kind of scaffold or assistance can the teacher parent actually provide? I think the use of AI is dangerous for young learners, but can I ask for the best way of using them?
Well, this is like a same, argument with variety of Englishes, right? So the earlier the better is such a strong belief, and I don't know. We need to keep telling the parents that's not always the case, especially in foreign language context. And I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't answer the question because it is so complicated. But I think, gradually people need to realize that the most important part is acquiring the native-like, pronunciation or native-like fluency should not be the goal, right? That is not something that we want to have. So we need to celebrate our variety of Englishes and then different kinds of pronunciation or different, lexical use and things like that. So I think that goal setting itself is really manipulate the people's way of thinking. If you think that native like pronunciation is the best, and then people started rush to cram schools and English language schools and early bilingual programs and spend so much money on it. And this is the reality. So I'm sorry, I can't answer the question.
It's okay. We've been asking really difficult questions. We've been really asking maybe a little bit too much, but I think at least I hope the other attendees as well. But I've got a lot of inspiration from this talk. So I really thank you for your availability and for having spent so much time with us today. Uh, I will now stop the recording, but I would like to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Professor Butler.